addition to having that daily practice as part of my routine, the other piece of it that I found really helpful is having some limitations. So as a percussionist, space is really important to us. We need to have space where we can be loud. We need to have space where we can set up big instruments. We need to have access to those big instruments in the first place, because not everybody has a marimba and a vibraphone and a drum set and timpani at their home. Maybe they have one or two of those things, but it's hard to find the space for all of that. My artistic output also changes a lot depending on where I live or what my studio situation is like. So do I have a room where I can set up a drum set and play it without upsetting somebody? And if not, what do I have in my living space that I can play? What are things that I can play without making the people upstairs annoyed with me? And how can I continue to make music and be a percussionist even if I don't have a bunch of drums and percussion instruments around me at all times? Also, as a music teacher during all of this, I was simultaneously working on my own art and trying to figure out how to teach music, especially guitar and percussion classes, that were suddenly online classes when a lot of my students didn't have instruments of their own at home. So, and I wanted to also do that in a way that would give the kids some tools that they could work with beyond just our class. I've done a lot of recording found objects before all of this, so I decided this would be a great time to pick that back up to demonstrate to my students how they could do similar kinds of things on their own, but also to give myself that challenge of doing it alongside of them so that I would have good advice, and also it's really fun. I also wanted to remind the kids that no matter what, no matter if they had access to a lot of instruments or didn't, they don't stop being musicians. They don't stop being artists. And so at times when artists are finding themselves bumping up against limitations, we as a group of people are really good at finding ways around that. But sometimes it just takes some practice. So throughout all of this, I was really fortunate to still have access to my studio space, but I decided to give myself some limitations when making these videos so that I could remove that excuse if I didn't feel like going to the studio. To also demonstrate to my students what they could do if they put their minds to it, and also because I really enjoy the way that limitations force me to be creative. So, for example, how could I make a whole piece of music out of just a jigsaw puzzle? What are all the different sounds that are possible with the puzzle that I might not have thought of otherwise if I had just gone to my studio and used a drum set? How many different sounds could I get from houseplants? I really like playing clay pots on their own, but I've never tried playing them with a plant inside. So I wanted to explore that a little bit. So even though the word limitations has a negative connotation, it can actually be a really useful creative tool that can help you expand your creativity, even if it's not in the directions that you were expecting. So about 6 years ago, I took a trip to the Pacific Northwest for 3 weeks. And this was at a time when I had just had two really close friends move out of town. And so I was going through this process where I was feeling really like scattered and grieving those losses, and also feeling pretty unsettled about my own sense of home and my sense of place. So I took this trip, and it gave me a chance to reconnect with some old friends and to just get out of town for a while and do a little bit of reflection. And so while I was there, I had taken like an old iPad with me, and I got super obsessed with making recordings on my iPad. So like my friends would go to bed, and then I would raid their kitchen cabinets for whatever kind of glassware things they had, or I would play with their kids' toys and make little recordings out of the different toys that they had laying around the house. Or I had a friend who had cut down a bunch of bamboo in his yard, and so I used all the bamboo sticks and played on different things that were in his yard. So I was just finding whatever I could around wherever I was traveling and making recordings with them. But the other thing that I was really enjoying doing was making recordings out in public places. So if I went to a cafe, there'd be the sound of like the barista knocking the espresso thing on the counter, or people clanking dishes together and things. So I would record those sounds too. But when I was out in public, I would want to mix them together and make these recordings kind of on the fly. So I would start to mix them, but in a public place I didn't have my headphones with me all the time, and so I couldn't really hear what I was doing. Instead, I was mixing it based on the waveform, so mixing it based on like where the loud parts and the soft parts were, how sustained it was, and really just based on what I could see and what I was guessing was happening. So I would try to line the recordings up in different ways or have them play off of each other. But as I was doing it, I didn't really know what I was getting. I didn't really know what it was going to sound like until I could listen later in a quiet place with some headphones. And so I got really obsessed with recording like that, where I would record things and not really be able to hear what I was doing, and just to kind of embrace that uncertainty and embrace the chaos of that was really fun. And it turned out to be this really therapeutic process for me of kind of leaning into that chaos and letting that guide my artistic process, and then having the process of creation be not so much about creating the ideas right from my head, but from sifting through the chaos that I found around me and pulling out what was good about it and arranging that chaos in ways that I could highlight the things I liked about it, or that the chaos would kind of show me what were the good things, and then I could highlight those and bring them out in the music myself. So ever since that trip, I've really kind of embraced this technique, I guess you could call it, in my own recordings, and trying to harness chaos, or even making that chaos from scratch, as a basis for composing. It's something that is really easy to do, especially at times when I'm feeling really scattered and I can't like get my mental energy to focus on something long enough to have a coherent idea. Or sometimes if I'm just feeling really unmotivated or tired or drained, it's something that I can do really easily just by playing a bunch of sloppy notes and recording it, and then putting it together, and then later on coming back to it and letting the creative part of it be the sifting through it and putting it back together. And it kind of became this interesting way of playing Exquisite Corpse by myself with music. So I would do a lot of multi-track recording, which for those of you who don't know is where a musician will record something and then they can go back and listen to what they recorded before while they play something new that's going to layer on top of that. And again, typically you listen to what you already recorded so that you can fit all the parts together, but I would purposefully turn the volume down so that I couldn't hear what I had recorded before. And then I would play something else on top of it. And then after doing several layers of that, go back and listen to what I've done and see if there were any places where the layers connected in interesting ways, or if they played off of each other in interesting ways. And sometimes I would do that with a metronome on so I could hear a steady tempo, but not necessarily hear what I had played already before. And sometimes I would just do it straight up with no tempo at all, and not even really try to worry about what the rhythm was, but just kind of let it happen. So at those times when my energy is feeling really scattered, or when I'm feeling really unmotivated and having a hard time getting myself to the studio or to my instruments, starting off with something like this where I'm just making noise and making a big chaotic mess is really easy, because it doesn't require a lot of energy from me, it doesn't require a lot of forethought, it's just something that I can do and spit out, and something to just get me in motion. And what I really like about it too is that it lets my hands take charge. And so sometimes if I don't particularly have an idea, or if I have an idea of something I want to do but I can't quite get the sounds to be what I want them to be, letting my hands take over and letting my brain shut off a little bit sometimes leads me exactly right to where I want to be with that. It becomes really therapeutic in a way. It reflects back to me that process of finding beauty in the midst of chaos, of looking around or listening to this sloppy mess of drums and metal junk and cafe sounds, and finding the beautiful parts and finding the ways that things line up that you might not have expected, and taking all of that and shaping it into something that is beautiful.